options volatility. So if you've never heard of this before, this is incredibly important to understand with options. So when I've started trading options, I kind of understood the leverage of it. I didn't really fully understand volatility, and I paid the price, for learning kind of the hard way. Options volatility is incredibly important to understand, especially around times like earnings, where the cost of your options is going to be inflated due to earnings. Now, I'll touch on that here and more in just a moment. So implied volatility, or sometimes referred to as just IV, or just volatility, or vol for short, is a representation of how volatile the underlying asset will be before expiration. Implied volatility can be a good measure if options are under or overvalued. With a high implied volatility, this would imply a large move from the underlying asset, but provides no indication of direction. So, just in the name, it's implying that whatever the underlying asset is will be, how volatile. So it's basically a measurement of how volatile they think the underlying asset will be. So I touched on this just a second ago with earnings. So the closer you get to earnings, what you typically see, and basically every time, is implied volatility continues to go up the closer you get to earnings. So if this is, we'll use Apple again as the example, and if Apple is supposed to report earnings, I'm trying to remember when they reported, just recently. Basically, the closer you get to that expiration of the contract, the more the option contracts are basically going to be overpriced. So typically, in an earnings type situation, people who really don't know what they're doing, if they're buying options, they're typically going to be significantly overpriced, because when earnings happens, volatility completely drops, because there's not this idea basically around earnings. Stocks can be super volatile, where they move up and down by double-digit percentages sometimes, and that's just a well-known thing. So there is this implied volatility is going to be higher. I know it's sort of a funky thing to kind of wrap your head around, but really it's just a measurement of saying, okay, well, normally, this stock is trading at this, and so we'll get into that actually. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but and I touched on this kind of a little bit. Implied volatility can be a great indicator, whether you should be buying or selling options. So I mentioned that at the beginning of the presentation, is that you can buy a call or sell a call, or buy a put or sell a put, and that really determines, or implied volatility can determine what you should be doing with options. So if you're looking at the implied volatility and it's much higher than normal, that's basically telling you that the options are going to be somewhat overpriced, and it's a better environment to sell options, where when you're selling an option, you're getting a credit for selling it, being the option writer. So, and here's basically in the option chain, you can see here with that yellow arrow once again, for those particular contract weeks. So, at the time of putting this together, you can see the weekly contracts at that time, the implied volatility was 31%. The following week it was up, 9%, and just a little bit below that. Now, depending on what historically it's at, they may be high or low, but you can see, just for the fact that it went up by 9 points, there's something going on that week, and I believe that was, I can't remember when they reported earnings, to be honest. It's been kind of crazy the last few weeks, but either way, this is basically saying that, okay, we're expecting something bigger to happen this week, and right here is sort of the expected move in terms of points. So 219, so they're expecting 7 points in those 6 days on that particular contract. And like I said, once again, in something like this, so the November 18 contracts, or excuse me, the November 2nd contracts, you'd be looking at selling options with something like this, because the IV is so much higher. So you're basically saying that the options are sort of overpriced because they're expecting a bigger than normal move. So the other side of this is historical volatility. So historical volatility is a representation of how far whatever underlying asset deviates from its mean value or moving average. So you can basically say, okay, I want to look at a 21 period historical volatility, and it'll basically show you kind of that average over that period, what the volatility is for that underlying asset. So if you set that for 21 days, that's basically 5 trading, or basically a little more than 4 trading sessions. And what you'd be looking at in that case is an average of that. And 21 is something I'll look at sometimes at 34, and those are Fibonacci numbers. A lot of people look at like a 20 period average. But basically what you would do in this situation, or what I like to do in this situation, is look at historical against implied. So historical is saying, okay, over the last 21 periods, this is what the volatility has been. In the case where your IV is low, for example, that could be an option, an opportunity rather, to buy options. Now, buying options is something that if you're new to trading options, you really probably shouldn't do. Depending on what you're doing, if it's a butterfly, you're going to be buying butterflies, but just buying calls or puts outright, it really, there's a lot of factors that going into that, with things like theta decay, which we'll get into just briefly here in just a moment, but other things like, just timing the move itself, because even if you're right to an extent, where you get some upward movement, it really depends on, once again, the implied volatility, where the options overpriced when you bought them, and things like that. So looking at IV before making a decision to buy or sell options is incredibly important. And once again, so if you're looking at historical volatility, it's something like, just for easy math, say it's 10 normally, that's really low. But if they're currently 20% implied volatility, then the options are incredibly overpriced at the moment, or they're expecting a bigger than average move. And if you have some bias on directions, then you basically would sell options to take advantage of the high implied volatility. So does that all make sense? I know I'm kind of going a little fast through this, but really want to just kind of get through this stuff. There's not, once again, I want to reiterate that this shouldn't be daunting. I think it's something that people get so caught up on the, tons of details that you can really get into with options. But if you look at this from just a very simplistic way, there are some key things to kind of follow. And I am a big proponent of the more you learn, the more you earn. So there's just a ton to learn about options, but I'm trying to give you sort of the nuts and bolts of what's important to really kind of, dive in and get started.